Everyone's heard the advice. If you're building a cheap gaming PC, just buy a used graphics card. It's the best option. And yeah, that sounds right. But the real question is, which used cards should you actually go for? And what kind of risks come with them? So if you're sitting there on eBay trying to choose between a bunch of different listings, today I'm going to help you figure out the best picks for a tight budget. Let's get started. After digging through listings for days, I finally narrowed it down to 5 GPUs that I personally think are the most worth spending money on. I'm going to go over the pros and cons of each one, and I definitely recommend you think it through before you buy, because this is just my own hands-on opinion. Hopefully you can use this as a reference, and for the test bench today, I'm using a B760 motherboard, an Intel i5-12600K, and 32 gigabytes of RAM. Alright, first up, the RX 6608 gigabytes. This card launched in late 2021, and when it came out, AMD didn't really make a huge deal out of it, like they do with some of their other GPUs. It was released mainly to go up against NVIDIA's RTX 3060. What I like most about the RX 6600 is simple. It runs cool, it doesn't pull much power, and it's great for 1080p. On eBay, it usually sits around about $140. Now, there are a couple downsides. Ray tracing performance is weak, and with 8 gigabytes of VRAM, some newer games with heavier textures can start to feel a bit limited. Also, since this card runs at PCIe X8, if you're on an older motherboard that's stuck on PCIe 3.0, you can lose some performance. Alright, now let's jump into the real-world testing. Alright, first up, Fortnite. I'm playing at 1080p, medium settings using DirectX 12. With these settings, FPS stays above 140 most of the time just running around, and during fights it drops to around 110. Overall, it feels really smooth. Next up, Black Myth Wukong. I'm testing at 1080p on low settings, and I'm turning ray tracing on. Once I'm in-game, FPS stays surprisingly stable at around 100, even during heavier fights with a lot of effects on screen. And if you want a Team Green option that still does really well at 1,080 pounds, with used prices that are pretty easy to swallow, then the next card I want to talk about is the GTX 1660 Super 6 gigabytes. This one launched back in 2019, and right now on eBay it usually goes for around 90 to 100 bucks. It comes with GDDR6 memory. And one of the big upgrades with the 1660 Super is memory bandwidth. It jumps from 192 gigabytes per second up to 336 gigabytes per second. Now, the downside is pretty similar to the RX 6600. You've only got 6 gigabytes of VRAM, so in some newer games, ultra textures can be a bit of a stretch. Alright, now let's talk gaming performance. Alright, let's keep it going with Fortnite. I'm at 1080p on medium settings. In fights, I'm getting around 93 FPS, and just moving around normally, it stays over 100. My 1% lows are around 76, which is really solid. That tells me the GTX 1660 Super is running pretty stable here. Now let's move over to Black Myth Wukong 1080p low settings. And here I'm staying above 70 FPS pretty consistently. Gameplay feels smooth, and this test really shows the 1660 Super can still handle AAA games, as long as you use sensible settings. Next up, we've got a graphics card with 16 gigabytes of RAM, the Radeon MI50. Now, this is not a gaming GPU. It was originally designed for servers and heavy compute workloads like AI and HPC. That said, it does have some specs that can actually benefit gaming. In terms of raw performance, it's often compared to something around an RTX 3060 12GB level. Out of the box, this card didn't even come with a fan, but somehow the seller modified it, using a custom 3D printed shroud and adding a dedicated fan for the blower-style heatsink. This particular MI50 version was made specifically for the Chinese market, and now you can actually find them on eBay for around $110. Alright, let's jump into some games, starting with Black Myth Wukong. I'm testing at 1080p medium settings. With this setup, FPS stays very stable, always above 60. The downside here is temperature. The GPU runs pretty hot, sitting around 86 degrees Celsius most of the time. Next up, Fortnite. Once again, 1080p, low settings. And here I'm seeing around 130 to 140 frames per second. Gameplay feels smooth and consistent, but power draw is definitely on the high side. It's pulling around 140 watts. And if you're looking for another option with 8GB of RAM, something that's a bit more comfortable in games with heavier textures, then the next card on the list is the GTX 1078GB. This card originally launched back in 2016. And even today, it's still a GPU I think is worth talking about. On eBay, pricing usually sits around $100. In terms of raw performance, it still holds up pretty well, especially in esports titles, and even in some AAA games. That said, there are a few downsides. The GTX 1070 doesn't support ray tracing, and you don't get DLSS either. On top of that, power consumption is relatively high, which means higher temps compared to some newer cards. So how does it actually perform in real-world gaming? Let's take a look. Alright, sticking with Fortnite, I'm at 1080p on low settings. With this setup, I'm getting around 140 FPS, and during fights, it drops to about 120. Now let's move over to Black Myth, Wukong. Once again, I'm testing at 1080p on low settings, and in combat, FPS stays above 60, and it's very stable. One thing to keep in mind though, the GTX 1070 Ti does pull a decent amount of power. I'm seeing around 134 watts. And if your budget is even tighter, but you still want 8GB of VRAM, then the RX 588GB is a card I really can't ignore. This one launched back in 2017, and even today a lot of people are still interested in it, mainly because that 8GB buffer can really help. For the money, it can handle a lot of games surprisingly well, and in some titles, 1440p is actually pretty playable with the right settings. But there are some real downsides. Power draw is high, around 180 watts, so it runs hotter and you need a decent power supply. And the biggest risk with the RX 580 is that a lot of them on the used market were mined on. So you have to be careful. One more thing, there's also an RX 580 2048 SP version out there, and that card is closer to an RX 570 than a real RX 580. Alright, now let's get into the real-world performance. Alright, back to Fortnite. I'm at 1080p on low settings. During gunfights, I'm seeing around 96 FPS. And in lighter scenes, where there's less going on, FPS stays above 100. Now let's move on to Black Myth, Wukong. Same setup, 1080p, low settings. And here I'm getting around 60 to 70 FPS. Even with the RX 580 pinned at 100% usage, gameplay still feels smooth, and overall, the experience is actually really solid. And here's a card that was super popular back in the day, the GTX 974GB. But the big question now is 4GB still enough? At this point, the price is really cheap, and it can still make sense if you're just playing lighter games or doing basic 1080p gaming. But let's be honest, 4GB of VRAM today is very limiting. It's only really enough for a smaller group of lighter titles, and newer games can run into VRAM issues fast. Now, the biggest downside with the GTX 970 is the VRAM situation. Even though it's marketed as 4GB, the memory is basically split into two sections. 3.5GB that's faster and prioritized, and 0.5GB that's slower and lower priority. Alright, let's run the benchmarks and see how it actually performs. Alright, moving on with this GPU, I'm running 1080p on low settings, and here I'm getting around 73 FPS. That said, I did notice some minor drops right at the start of the match. And since this is a 4GB card, it's definitely more limited overall. Next up, Black Myth Wukong. I'm still at 1080p on low settings, and with this setup, FPS stays above 50 most of the time. One thing I'll give it, during fights with a lot of effects on screen, frame pacing is actually pretty stable. Alright, so there you go. That's everything on these 5 budget graphics cards. At the end of the day, just pick the one that fits your PC and your needs the best. And keep in mind, this is just my personal opinion based on my testing. If you found this video helpful, hit the like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next one.